Good evening and welcome to this evening's webinar as part of the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas and the Australian Association of International Relations webinar, and we're really lucky to have this chance to work our partnership together. First of all, I need to introduce myself. I'm Kim Boyer. I'm the State President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. And as part of the association, the institutes and the universities' high regard and reflection of the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Palawa people, and for those who are across other parts of Australia and the world, we recognise those Indigenous leaders past, present and emerging as well. The Island of Ideas has been a program that's been designed to keep ideas flowing in this weird and wonderful year of COVID. And it's been a remarkable partnership with the university with a number of organisations, but especially ours. Now, before I introduce our wonderful speaker tonight, just a few housekeeping rules. Your mic and your camera and chat function and hand raised functions have all been disabled, so our speaker won't be interrupted. But we do encourage you to ask questions. So if you want to ask questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So please type your questions into that and we'll try to get to as many as possible of them at the end of the session. And finally, the lecture is being recorded so you can access it later on either YouTube or on the SoundCloud channels. So I have great pleasure in introducing our speaker for tonight. Lisa Singh, the Honourable Lisa Singh, is a former Senator for Tasmania and a former State Minister for Tasmania. She's a highly regarded Member of Parliament and was in fact the first person of South Asian heritage to be elected to the Federal Parliament. Lisa's parliamentary career focused on the promotion and protection of human rights, foreign policy, trade and international development. And to this end, and as a key member on the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, Lisa was instrumental in the development of Australia's Modern Slavery Act. She's currently the head of Government Advocacy Asia and Australia Pacific at Walk Free, an international human rights organisation working to end modern slavery. They were very lucky to actually recruit someone of Lisa's immense talent and passion and understanding. Lisa also is Deputy Chair of the Australian Government's Australia-India Council. She's also a member of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, and we love having her. So thanks, Lisa. Lisa's going to be talking to us tonight on human trafficking, modern slavery, and the multilateral system.
Thank you so much, Kim, and also to the Australian Institute of International Affairs Tasmanian branch for inviting me to be part of this webinar, and also, of course, to my old alma mater, the University of Tasmania, for hosting this Island of Ideas lecture series. Really excited to be with so many people listening in from all parts of the globe this evening to discuss the role of the United Nations and its member states in addressing what I would call some of the most heinous crimes, human trafficking and modern slavery. This is, of course, an area of international human rights law that I've been engaged with, as Kim sort of touched on there, since my time in the Australian Senate. That was advocating on issues from a living wage for garment workers in Bangladesh to the need for, of course, an Australian Modern Slavery Act, which we now do have in place. And it is so pleasing for me why now I'm also part of continuing that work through Walk Free, such an important organisation internationally in this space. So what I'm going to do now is just share my screen, and that should hopefully be clear for everybody. To start a presentation, and just to start with, on any given day, tens of millions of people throughout the world are being exploited through force, fraud and coercion. And in fact, the exploitation of people remains one of the most pervasive human rights abuses on the planet. It's an affront to human dignity and takes away a human being's freedom and opportunity to live a decent life. So today, I want to share with you data that outlines modern slavery globally, the UN system and member states' responses to this and how effective that has been, and what other activities are needed and indeed are happening to end modern slavery globally. Hopefully I can shift my, no, that's not moving forward. Hold on. There we are. Firstly, I just want to share a little bit about Walk Free. Walk Free is an independent international human rights organisation working to end modern slavery globally within our generation. Walk Free is the producer of the world's leading data set on measuring and understanding slavery, and that's the Global Slavery Index, which provides world-leading measurement of the size and the scale of modern slavery and assesses country-level vulnerability and government responses to the problem. Walk Free is also the Secretariat of the Bali Process Government and Business Forum, and I'll share a little bit more about that later. We are also engaged with faith leaders through the Global Freedom Network. The GFN advocates for systemic change by engaging and uniting faith leaders around the world to take spiritual and practical action to end modern slavery. And in collaboration with the Freedom Fund, Walk Free is scaling up on the most effective frontline anti-slavery responses in the countries and sectors where it is most prevalent. Just to start with, I think it's important to outline what we mean by modern slavery. So different countries use differing terminologies to describe modern forms of slavery, and this includes how they describe, slavery itself, but also other concepts such as human trafficking, forced labour, debt bondage, forced and servile marriage, and the sale and exploitation of children. We use the term modern slavery as an umbrella term that focuses on the attention on the commonalities across these concepts. Essentially, it refers, though, to situations of exploitation that a person cannot refuse or leave because of threats, violence, coercion, deception, abuse of power, and so on. And today, slavery is far from banished from our world. There are an estimated 40.3 million people trapped in these situations globally. And with the impact of COVID-19 now, this figure, I am sure, is a very conservative estimate. In fact, there are more slaves today than there were at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. And one of the reasons for that is that slavery is ingrained in the globalised economy, part of our everyday lives. It is more likely than not that when you buy a piece of clothing, a toy for your child, or even just talk on your mobile phone, that some part of that product will have been produced by slave labour. And this is occurring right across the globe, whether in wealthy countries like Australia or conflict and disaster-stricken states like Lebanon and Pakistan. Modern slavery is prevalent in all of these parts of the globe. In our latest Global Slavery Index, we also included a short list of products that with the highest risk of forced labour by source country. And this is based on 15 products that appeared most frequently in the 2016 US Department of Labor's list of goods produced by forced labour and supplemented by our own data on cocoa and fishing. I understand that since that time, the US Department of Labour has produced the 2020 list of goods produced by child labour or forced labour, which would show an even more up-to-date picture than the one I'm sharing. And you can find that on the US Department of Labor's website. So obviously some examples of modern slavery, many can be many and varied, but in all examples, they are violations of human rights and they're criminal. I think the right-hand picture here shows refugees and migrants queuing in a prison yard as they're loaded onto a bus to be transferred to another detention centre. They were sold by a militia group ruling the Serman detention camp in Libya. And of course, COVID-19 has exacerbated the inequalities and increased the risk, especially to migrant workers in supply chain. In fact, I think the ILO reports that some 1.6 out of the 2 billion people working in the informal economy are impacted by the COVID crisis. So that's nearly half the entire global workforce in danger of losing their livelihoods. And the lockdown measures have had an even more significant impact on these workers. Informal workers face the dilemma of either staying home and dying from hunger or working and dying from the virus. I think these economic shocks, like those associated with this pandemic, are also known to very much exacerbate child labour as families find new strategies to survive, which often leads to debt bondage and an increased reliance on informal recruitment agencies, leaving workers more exposed to exploitation. And the impact is the greatest on women and girls. So to break that down further, women and girls comprise 99% of all victims of forced sexual exploitation, 84% of all victims of forced marriage, 58% of all victims of forced labour, and 41% of victims of state-imposed forced labour. I think that last category, well, there's a number of recent examples. Obviously, the mass detention of over 1 million Uyghurs in government so-called re-education camps in the far western Xinjiang province, with factories linked to supply chains of some 83 or more global brands in technology, clothing, and automotive sectors, including Apple, BMW, Nike, Samsung, Sony, and the like. And I think even today I saw a story from The Guardian about a similar sort of state-imposed forced labour in North Korea, again involving garment workers, majority being female. Of course, though, you can't, as we say at Walk Free, you can't solve these human rights issues unless we can measure it and measure governments' responses to it. But there are a number of complexities of measuring modern slavery due to it being so hidden. So Walk Free collaborated with the International Labour Organisation, the ILO, and the International Organisation for Migration, the IOM, to develop the joint global estimates of modern slavery. And we also measure government responses and vulnerability factors. And our government responses are based on a conceptual framework using situational crime prevention theory in consultation with independent expert working groups to track government progress and assess over a number of indicators and across 5 milestones. And all of our data, by the way, is publicly available online on walkfree.org. A total of some near 100,000 data points. So what are governments across the globe doing about it, and how effective is the international community in ending modern slavery? As of February 2019, our research highlights that there are governments taking the most, governments taking the most action to address modern slavery. And these countries are, particularly characterised by strong political will, high levels of resources, and an active civil society that holds these governments to account. However, these rankings can also be assessed based on best and worst responses relative to wealth, which would show a whole different set of countries' responses. For example, a strong response relative to wealth of countries in the world are Georgia, Nigeria, Ukraine, Moldova, Ethiopia, and Mozambique. So what is the role of multilateralism in addressing modern slavery? Well, as we know, the United Nations provides a very important platform for some 193 member states, both large and small, to have a voice. And that voice was expressed in 2015, where member states signed up to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And this includes Goal 8, Target 7, or 8.7 as we call it, the elimination of all forms of child labour by 2025 and the eradication of forced labour, modern slavery and human trafficking by 2030. And complementing that, there is a strong body of UN conventions, declarations and protocols guiding state actors on how to go about legislating for change to end slavery, some of which have been in place since the League of Nations, such as the Slavery Convention. But the number of countries that have ratified these conventions varies. The Slavery Convention, I think, sits at around 99 countries. The Forced Labour Convention, P29, sits at about 47 countries that have ratified. The ILO Abolition of Forced Labour 105 is about 176 countries. So all of these conventions, and there's other mechanisms as well, such as the ILO's Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, focus on the elimination of forced and compulsory labour and are widely recognised and supported by governments. They all create important architecture for governments to act and work together to end the world's most heinous crimes. Out of them, though, I do want to just highlight the PALERMO protocols, because the PALERMO protocols, I think it was just last week, it was 20 years that the United Nations General Assembly adopted this new convention against transnational organised crime. And the PALERMO protocol to prevent, suppress and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, is the one to focus on here. For the past 2 decades, this addition to international law has been the starting point for political and legal conversations about labour exploitation and migrant exploitation through very much a criminal justice lens rather than a labour or migrants' rights lens. And I think that focus on criminal justice, or on crime, has meant that in those last 20 years, this has nearly become a universally ratified convention with some 178 states in the past 2 decades. That's quite a speed. But despite a range of well-funded anti-trafficking efforts, criminal prosecutions do still remain very rare. And Australia itself hasn't ratified all of these conventions. There's still some outstanding, including the Domestic Workers Convention. I think considering 1 in 25 women workers in the world are domestic workers, this is an important convention to ratify. Also the ILO Convention P29, which obligates parties to provide protection and remedies to victims of forced labour. I think that is almost going to be ratified. I'd like to say hopefully next year in Australia, because at the moment we're just waiting on the state of WA, Western Australia, to pass state legislation. Once that's done, then every state in Australia will have passed the necessary state legislation for the federal government to ratify that particular protocol. Also, one that has now become universally ratified is the ILO Worst Forms of Child Labour Convention. Thanks very much to Tonga, because this year, in fact, it was Tonga's ratification of Convention 182, which has meant that it is now become universally ratified. So that was a great effort by our Pacific Island neighbour And another important piece of the fabric in the multilateral space on addressing modern slavery is the recent 2011 endorsement by the UN Human Rights Council on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which provide a global standard for preventing and addressing the risk of adverse impacts on human rights linked to business activities. So the UN Guiding Principles make it clear that member states must protect against human rights abuses by setting greater corporate accountability within their jurisdiction, and should clearly set out the expectation that businesses respect human rights through their operations, including their supply chains. But how effective has all of this multilateral architecture been in addressing and indeed ending slavery? Around the world, in countries that have ratified conventions, enacted national legal instruments, trafficking and slavery still remains, and it is becoming evident that governments are not on track to eradicate modern slavery and achieve SDG 8.7 by 2030. In fact, there are more people today living in slavery than ever. So it is clear that governments cannot solve these issues alone. Multilateralism is an effective tool to collaborate, for governments to join and to follow rules to end slavery. But in a globalised economy where supply chains are hidden and demand for cheap products is high, leading to the exploitation of cheap labour in developing countries, it is clear that other actors need to be involved if we are going to end modern slavery. So this year's UN General Assembly, its 75th year, it focused on the importance of multilateralism in today's world, and it identified 5 pillars of a great reset that we need to accomplish a more equitable and just global reality after the pandemic. This slide shows our co-founder Grace Forrest sharing with the virtual UN Security Council why more concrete action is required. So how can governments engage with other actors to address modern slavery? Well, in recent years, starting with the UK government, we have seen there's starting to be some recognition of the significant risks of modern slavery in global supply chains of businesses operating within their own countries. So some have legislated to ensure that these large businesses address this significant risk. Supply chain reporting is an important part of the jigsaw to address modern slavery, and highlights that governments recognise that they have a critical leadership role to play in encouraging and guiding corporations to take the necessary steps to ensure the integrity of their supply chains. Of course, it requires collaboration. It requires governments to encourage businesses to look and find and be open about what they discover in their supply chains. And I think in doing so as a global community, we must support them and not shame them in that process. But having a robust Modern Slavery Act, which clearly compels companies to pay attention to the risks in their supply chains, to have that conversation at the boardroom table, has a very beneficial impact, both by stopping the practice of modern slavery and by creating a level playing field amongst companies. Obviously, the most recent out of these piece of legislation I'm sharing today is the Australian Modern Slavery Act. And in fact, this year, for the first time, large Australian businesses will be reporting to the Australian government on modern slavery in their supply chains. I understand the first tranche of those modern slavery statements by corporations in Australia will be made publicly available soon on the Modern Slavery Register website. And I think the Australian Act, I think it reflects an increasing demand across many of the world's wealthiest countries for businesses to act ethically and ensure their supply chains are free from modern slavery. Because as consumers in higher income countries, we ourselves are complicit in consuming products that are made using slave labour somewhere else in the world. Which is why the Bali Process Government and Business Forum was established in 2017, because there was a clear need for government and the private sector to work together to combat forced labour and human trafficking. So this was a new initiative that brought together influential business leaders and foreign ministers from 45 member countries in the Indo-Pacific region, as well as UN bodies, to consider ways to combat human trafficking and modern slavery. And it highlights the potential of regional government and private sector collaboration. It was the first of its kind in the Indo-Pacific region, and it's a really positive step towards the kind of collaboration between government and business that is needed to end these crimes. And it's become a permanent track of the Bali process. Walk Free acts as the secretariat for this Bali Process Government and Business Forum. Its guiding framework, the Acknowledge, Act, Advance recommendations, or the AAA recommendations as they're known, were endorsed by Bali Process member states and business leaders at the 2018 Ministerial Conference. And these principles set out a framework for action on supply chain transparency, ethical recruitment, worker protection, and redress. In fact, the AAA recommendations are the first regional policy document agreed to by governments and business that calls for government and business to take action to address and eradicate human trafficking, forced labour, modern slavery, and child labour across the Indo-Pacific. Another recent initiative of cross-government and private sector collaboration includes the Liechtenstein Initiative for Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking, or FAST as it's known. It's a multi-sector partnership. It was started from the support of the Liechtenstein, Australia, and Netherlands governments on how the financial services actors can contribute to help eradicating modern slavery and human trafficking. And its blueprint outlines slavery as a market failure. And what is most interesting here is the fact that the finance has such an enormous influence over the global economy. Walk Free has partnered with FAST to promote financial sector action to eradicate modern slavery. Walk Free and FAST are supporting a new initiative only launched a week ago called Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking, Asia Pacific, which looks at how modern slavery risk factors in the current investment landscape, how it aims to increase awareness of modern slavery risks among the broader investor and business community, and provide a framework for investors to address those risks. And much of this is a response to the broader shift to take investors' exposure to environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, risks more seriously. Walk Free acts as the secretariat for this initiative and acts also as a knowledge partner. And you may have also seen today, in fact, there's a story in the Australian Financial Review which shares that a coalition of some 24 investors that represent $5.8 trillion in action under management have written to the 100 largest companies on the ASX stock exchange, telling them to take the risks of modern slavery and human trafficking more seriously. And this is exactly what this initiative aims and is about. So, although this is all a huge international challenge, there is a way forward if countries and businesses work together and acknowledge that there is more to be done. And of course, civil society has an equally important role to play to hold governments and businesses to account, for example, by monitoring and keeping track of the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, as shown through our research. And I think also as we move into the UN International Year for the Elimination of Child Labour, which is next year, 2021, and with the countdown towards meeting the SDGs only a decade away, and with the added vulnerabilities for workers created by COVID-19, We need the multilateral system and all its actors to be stronger and take action now more than ever through strengthening policy and legislative frameworks, because we all have a role to play in eradicating modern slavery. And I think that starts with each and every one of us, and how, as consumers, we play a role in that as well. So thank you. If you'd like any further information about Walk Free's research on addressing modern slavery, please go to our website. It is all publicly available, including our data and data points, as well as a range of resources and publications on the research that we do and that we collaborate with our partners on. Thank you, Kim.
Thanks, Lisa. And thanks, everyone. We've got a couple of questions so far. So I'm going to start off with one of mine. Lisa, I noticed in your the countries that are doing well and the countries that are doing not so well, that there weren't any South American countries in that. Is this not an issue for South America, or is it just something that is off their radar?
No, not at all, Kim. I think what I was trying to do is probably give you a tiny snapshot of the sort of the best and the worst, and South America probably falls somewhere in the middle of all of those. Definitely there are vulnerabilities in South America, particularly in relation to the cocoa industry, and a range of other industries as well. And in fact, I think the list that I provided of the products from the US Department of Labor also had some from South America. But one of the sort of big vulnerabilities in South America, Kim, is actually child domestic work. I know that I touched on domestic labour and in terms of some of the conventions, but child domestic work and also commercial child sexual exploitation are areas of vulnerability for people in South America. So the Global Slavery Index, though, would outline, and the Measurement Action Freedom Report would outline a lot more detail in terms of which countries in South America are doing well or not doing well, and government responses to them. So for more detail, I encourage you to have a look at our data on that online.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. So I've got a question from Susan Innes, who's the Secretary of the Religions for Peace group and in Australia, and she's asking, are you linking with the Asian Conference with Religions for Peace or religious leaders in Asia in this matter?
Thank you, Kim, and thank you, Susan, for your question. I think, as I shared at the outset, Walk Free has developed since 2014 the Global Freedom Network, which allows us to engage with faith leaders and actually look at systemic and cultural changes that are needed. And I know that our team, as part of that work, participate with a range of different religious organisations, conferences and the like. I'm unsure of that specific conference you refer to, Susan, but happy to follow that up. I'm sure that we're very much aware of it and would be happy to provide any input.
Okay, another question. Can you comment on the Australian Federal Police and how they work in this area in Australia and Asia?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of the Australian Federal Police, but from my time both in the Australian Senate as a former Deputy Chair of the Law Enforcement Committee, I used to meet with the Australian Federal Police quite regularly, and also now in my role as part of the Australian Government's roundtable on human trafficking and modern slavery and its expert advisory group on the Modern Slavery Act. I'm aware of the AFP's ongoing role in this space, particularly through the criminal justice lens. There is, for example, in Australia, a human trafficking visa. I know the AFP play a role in the sort of implementation or engagement of that for those that have been that meet the criteria. The AFP, of course, work with state and territory police as well on human trafficking. I know that they probably sit on a number of interdepartmental committees to do with human trafficking, particularly around the areas of forced marriage as well in Australia. The AFP have played a role in developing awareness, particularly at our international airports in Australia, on identifying forced marriage and training Border Force staff and also others at the airport that work at the airport in identifying, looking for signs in relation to forced marriage. So the AFP play an ongoing important role. I think the last financial year, the AFP received some 223 reports of human trafficking, 92 of those, 92 forced marriage, 40 sexual servitude and exploitation, 29 forced labour, 28 trafficking, 20 domestic servitude, 4 trafficking in children, 3 debt bondage and 1 slavery. So that's from the AFP's own annual report for the last financial year. So their role is an ongoing important one.
Okay. The next question is about as a consumer, how do we know if a product that one buys is being produced by people in a modern slavery situation?
That's a really good question. This is what I say, and I know that our co-founder, Grace Forrest, who has quite a following in this consumer space, says time and time again, is to ask. When you go into a clothing store, if we just take the garment sector as an example, to actually ask those workers in that store, can they provide details into the supply chain of that particular brand? There are some sort of apps or websites, for example, Baptist World Aid provide a list of a number of sort of garments and different brands in relation to a scorecard on their supply chains. I think, though, what is going to start to happen, and this is where, of course, we don't know sometimes whether or not there is slavery in some of the products that we consume. What is going to start happening is more and more transparency around this because of Australia now having a Modern Slavery Act. I think this is a really, really important part of the jigsaw in ending and addressing modern slavery. So part of the legislation that Australia has in place is that the statements that those large businesses in Australia report on slavery on this year will be made publicly available. So the Australian Border Force have created a website called the Modern Slavery Register, and anyone will be able to go on that website and look at the statements that those large companies are providing that go back through their supply chains, looking at what sort of remediation they may have done, what they actually have done to address modern slavery. But I think I said before, Kim, this shouldn't be about necessarily naming and shaming, but actually working with those brands and companies and businesses to actually want to make a change and do something about it. And that's what's really important, I think, and what makes the Australian Modern Slavery Act so sort of more, better in a way than perhaps our UK counterparts, because it does actually require them to not just do a tick and flick, but actually to go back and actually look at how they can address modern slavery within those supply chains. But this is all about getting informed about modern slavery, looking at its core drivers, encouraging consumers to demand that sort of transparency. Our resources on our website, on walkfree.org, there's a You section where it says, as a citizen and a consumer in a globalised world, you can take action, and we provide some information on there on how that can happen.
Lisa, one of the other questions, which you've probably mostly answered in that reply, but I'll just ask it in case there's something you want to add, is what are the key modern slavery issues within Australia and how can we best address them?
Well, within Australia itself, I mean, obviously, as we just talked about, yep, there's definitely the products that we buy every day. But if we're talking about modern slavery within Australia, then issues to do with migrant workers, even the vulnerabilities for seasonal workers from the Pacific Islands have shown that they are at risk of modern slavery. I think that the last data showed there was some 4,000 people within Australia in some form of modern slavery. Some of those are picking the fruit that we eat, working in agriculture, construction, domestic work, meat processing, cleaning, hospitality and food services. And these are known as the high-risk industries in Australia. This is where, you know, the work of the Australian government through its various agencies, the Fair Work Ombudsman, the Department of Home Affairs and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade are playing an important role. But we as consumers can also play an important role in doing our utmost to not sort of contribute to modern slavery in all its forms.
Okay, one of our younger professional members of the audience have asked, what's the best way for a young professional to become involved in a career for working against modern slavery?
Oh, right.
I'm not sure whether your career pattern is exactly the optimum one.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, that there are sort of a range of professions if you're talking about modern slavery for a young professional to be involved. Obviously, there's the legal form. If someone had a law background and was following a role as a lawyer in that space, there's clearly the business angle. If they are working within a large business or even a small business or professional services, playing a role to ensure that there is some ESG or corporate social responsibility management within that business. There is civil society, of course, which is the area that I work in, which tries to advocate both at the business and government level for policy change. So there is a range of areas, and I think there is a number of very good organisations, businesses, and obviously government playing all a role together for people to engage in a career in this space.
Okay, you referred before about not wanting to be necessarily involved in naming and shaming, but one of our questions is it actually the time for people to use social media to do some naming and shaming, and if not, why not?
Well, I mean, obviously social media plays an important role in terms of raising awareness. I think it plays an incredibly important role. But the way one goes about that is, you know, for me, I think it's better to work with businesses and governments rather than continually name and shame. I think it is worth highlighting some fairly major atrocities that are occurring in whatever part of the world or they may be. But then it's the next step that's most important. How do we actually make a change? If we just sort of name and shame without finding solutions to address some of these issues, then we won't sort of get anywhere. So I guess that was the point that I was trying to make before. And the other thing is that the naming and shaming of businesses may in fact be counterintuitive. It may end up alienating those businesses that may be starting out on their journey to address modern slavery. And that's exactly what it is, Kim. It is a journey of making change, of recognising the need for, you know, that we are all one shared humanity. We're talking about people at the end of the day. And, you know, through processes of being transparent about our supply chains, ethical recruiting, these are the ways that companies and businesses can make a difference. And we definitely don't want to alienate them in that process. We want to support and encourage them.
So another question on that same tangent with a slightly different suggestion comes from Susan Westcott, who says that she just returned from India, where she bought carpets in Jaipur and an electric car with a lithium battery. The people who sell these products cannot or won't easily supply the supply chain. Should we make governments forbid these products?
Well, I mean, this is the nature of living in a globalised economy, and the way to address this is exactly through what I shared today, which was having legislation in place, supply chain transparency legislation, where businesses actually do have to report. If a country doesn't have any reporting mechanism in place, then of course they don't have to do anything about it. And what you end up having is an unlevel playing field where you've got some businesses that actually do want to do the right thing and have that ethical component within their business, and others that don't. And you know, and as consumers, we're none the wiser to the two. So the important thing here is actually having some sort of mechanism in place in, you know, as we would like to see in as many countries as possible, supply chain transparency laws that actually require those businesses to have to report about their supply chains.
Thank you. So we have a question about the work of the National Roundtable on Modern Slavery. How do you assess its work, and especially from the point of view of how does it change something on the ground?
I think what I shared today is that, you know, obviously governments can't end modern slavery on their own. You know, I shared the importance of business as one of those actors that has to be engaged with government and that collaboration. The other actor that's so important in holding governments to account, in holding businesses to account, is civil society organisations. So that's where the Australian government's roundtable that it has created plays such an important role, because it allows civil society to have a seat at the table with government to actually address human trafficking and modern slavery. And part of that, of course, is the implementation that governments around the world have of their national action plans. So the Australian government's national action plan to address modern slavery and human trafficking. For civil society, we play that role of the roundtable in looking at the detail of the National Action Plan. And I'll just flag, Kim, that the Australian government's new National Action Plan on modern slavery and human trafficking will be launched before the end of this year. So watch this space.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm sure that your past had no small part to play in that. So Joel Quirk asks or comments that lead firms at the head of global supply chains often have a direct financial interest in driving down wages and conditions in ways that manufacture exploitation and abuse, and yet transparency legislation assumes that these firms will independently connect out of the good of their hearts, as that there's no meaningful sanctions. Should we be advocating for public regulation with meaningful sanctions?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question, because it's one that is there's an ongoing debate, let's say, that continues both here in Australia, but also in the UK and in the EU, as to whether there should be, whether you call it sanctions or penalties, put on those businesses that basically are not, that are not, you know, living by the legislation that they need to report under, or aren't providing adequate or effective or quality sort of statements as part of that. The Australian Act tried, I think, you know, in the development and the implementation of the Australian Act, it tried to make sure, firstly, that the Act is mandatory, which it is. It's mandatory for businesses to report. But no, our Act in Australia doesn't have penalties, nor does the UK Act. I know that the EU is currently looking at a Human Rights Due Diligence Act, which again is a different sort of process that looks more at those sort of root causes of modern slavery and human trafficking. I think, though, in terms of the question, an important part of the Australian Act was it has a 3-year review mechanism within it. That 3 years will be up at the end of next year, and civil society, business, we can all play a role through that review process of putting forward whether or not there should be some sort of penalty or sanction process in place. I think it's too early at the moment to sort of have an answer on that. I think we need to see in the Australian context what the modern slavery statements look like, what the compliance looks like to the Australian Act from businesses here. But I think we have an open mind to, what's the best way to ensure that businesses comply with legislation. At the end of the day, we want to ensure that we end modern slavery in our generation and achieve SDG 8.7. If we're going to do that, then we need to throw everything at it to make sure that we can get there. But of course, supply chain transparency legislation is only one tool, I think, as I mentioned, in the sort of the toolbox in addressing modern slavery. But the monitoring of statements, of these business statements, and the public reputation sort of risks to business through that monitoring exercise by civil society, hopefully will play a role in the interim of not having any sort of penalties in place.
Thank you. As we're moving towards the end of the questions, there's one fairly broad one about how does modern slavery tie in with global climate change and the climate change movement, comparing human labour with other carbon footprints?
Yeah, look, that's another really good question. At Walk Free, we've been engaged a lot with our Pacific Island countries. In fact, we produced a report recently this year called Murky Waters. It's on our website, which actually addresses the vulnerabilities for our Pacific Island neighbours in terms of modern slavery. And some of those vulnerabilities, one of those very clear vulnerabilities is climate change. Climate change results in forced displacement. It results in that irregular migration, which then, of course, drives vulnerabilities for individuals to slavery. So I think there is a direct link there between modern slavery and climate change, particularly in our region. And I think it's one we're going to have to continue to talk about as the impacts of climate change play out in our Pacific Island countries, because it could very well indeed increase those risks, particularly for women in terms of human trafficking, but also we've seen it already in terms of the displacement and forced migration factors that are taking place. But our report, Murky Waters, will provide more data and more detail on that.
Thanks, Lisa. One last question. You've talked briefly about the EU, and I just wonder whether the media that's been involved with the human trafficking and modern slavery in like the last 3 or 4 months, there was a Four Corners based from the UK on human trafficking and slavery, and also there was a terrific program on the crime thriller Shetland about women trafficking. How important are those sorts of stories and setting those human individual stories into the work that you do?
Oh, look, Kim, the media play an incredibly important role in terms of not only exposing a particular criminal activity, but also in giving survivors a voice. And this is an important part of our work that we advocate for at Walk Free. That's the survivor voice component. When we're talking about these issues of human trafficking and modern slavery, we are talking about people. And I think what Four Corners shared was the experience that those survivors of trafficking went through, giving them a voice, being able to then have that opportunity and then go through a prosecution of the persecutors is so important. But having the media play a role in exposing it educates all of us even more so to do our utmost to be more aware, to be more alert, and also to understand how to report these sorts of crimes, when we might see them. And I think I referred earlier to The Guardian just a couple of days ago that about a 3-month investigative report of work going on in a factory in North Korea near the China border, in making factory workers making the PPE equipment that has been sent to the UK, unbeknownst, of course, to the UK. So I think all of these sorts of forced labour, human trafficking stories through the media and elsewhere need to be exposed as much as possible. It only helps.
Thank you, Lisa. I think that's a good time, and we have to wind up now anyway. So thank you so much, and I'm sure that the audience would virtually thank you as well, with a lot of claps for your talk, but also your commitment and passion in driving this forward. We really appreciate it. If you've enjoyed this forum and you're not already a member of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, please consider joining us. This particular talk will be available soon via video on the university's website, and your screen's just showing you some of the many events that the university has had this year that you can still access on the website. This actually is the last of our webinars for 2020. What a strange year it's been, and probably before the beginning of this year most of us hadn't had anything to do with webinars, but it's been a great opportunity to share what's available from Tasmania and from abroad with our Tasmanian national and international audiences. So thanks everyone very much, and thanks for taking part. We'll be back in 2021. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim.